Just off New York's coastline sits a piece of land the public was never meant to set foot on. An island so heavily restricted, its name rarely appears on modern maps. And when it does, it's buried under layers of silence. For more than a century, this place has drawn questions, suspicion, and the occasional warning from those who know just enough to be uneasy. Tonight, we're going to step as close as the law allows and examine why this island remains one of the most concealed locations in American history. Stay with me until the end, because the final set of declassified files, released only a few years ago, contains a detail so specific that historians still question why it was ever classified in the first place. If true, it would change everything we thought we knew about this island, and the era that produced it. The earliest official mention of the island surfaces in government ledgers from the early 1900s, listed under a vague category, Federal Reserve Site. No explanation, no public statement, just a small island, taken quietly under federal control. At first, it didn't draw much attention. New York was expanding, building, modernizing. But locals living along the coastline noticed something unusual, even in those early years: armed patrols circling waters that had never required such protection. By the 1930s, fishermen knew better than to steer too close, and anyone who asked questions was told the same thing: government property, keep your distance. Around this time, strange deliveries began arriving under cover of darkness. Barges moved quietly across the water, escorted by small patrol crafts. On board were wooden crates, unmarked, heavily reinforced, transported directly into storage buildings near the shoreline. People working the docks later recalled how odd these crates looked. Too heavy for standard supplies, too secure for anything ordinary. Then came the reports of late-night lights flickering across the island long after any legitimate operations should have ceased. Some witnesses described a soft mechanical hum, steady, rhythmic, and completely foreign to coastal activity of that era. Still, no agency stepped forward to explain. In 1941, a New York newspaper challenged federal officials directly, pushing for answers. Their response was brief and guarded. The island, they said, hosted routine government operations. Nothing more. Nothing unusual. But the explanation didn't fit. If it truly was routine, why did the island never appear in public defense reports? Why was no civilian agency listed as its operator? And why, out of all the coastal facilities in the region, was this one fenced off tighter than military bases preparing for war? Even at the height of global conflict, the secrecy surrounding this island exceeded what most Americans ever saw. As the decades passed, scattered witness accounts began to surface. Some came from fishermen who recalled being shadowed by patrol boats whenever they drifted too close. Others came from lighthouse keepers who watched unmarked vessels unload equipment in the dead of night. One former dock worker claimed he once helped move sealed drums from a barge to a reinforced storage shed. He wasn't allowed to ask questions. He wasn't allowed to linger. 2 guards stood by the entire time, instructing workers to keep their eyes forward. Then there were the technicians, men who spent a few months performing repairs on the island, only to return home with instructions never to discuss their assignments. Many signed non-disclosure agreements that, according to them, had no expiration date. These accounts were scattered, disconnected, yet strangely consistent. By the end of World War II, the island's physical appearance began to shift. Newly constructed docks emerged on the eastern shoreline. Concrete towers were erected, each fitted with vantage points facing the horizon. Public documents from the Army Corps of Engineers reference containment structures built around this time. No explanation was offered for what required containment, or why an isolated island received such upgrades. Blueprints from the period show underground corridors carved beneath the surface. The tunnel systems were reinforced far beyond standard storage requirements. Thick concrete, steel webs, pressurized doors, details more commonly seen in facilities meant to withstand hazardous materials. Locals who lived nearby noticed the change. Some kept quiet. Others whispered, "Something dangerous is out there." As the Cold War began reshaping America's defense strategy, secrecy became routine. Laboratories, bunkers, and testing fields were scattered across the country, many hidden from the public eye. But even within that era of confidentiality, this island stood apart. In the 1950s, budget allocations referencing the island appeared under coded line items. Phrases like Facility 47 and Unit 14 operations were used instead of proper names. Federal agencies often disguised sensitive programs this way, but rarely for small offshore sites. Aerial photographs from the period reveal structures with reinforced ventilation systems, equipment designed not just to bring air in, but to keep something contained. Civil defense teams in nearby towns conducted drills named after the island. The drills involved emergency evacuations, contamination protocols, and restricted contact scenarios. Yet when questioned, officials insisted the island only housed coastal research equipment. One declassified letter from a naval test officer states, "If containment fails, relocation may be necessary." No further context. No follow-up explanation. Relocation of what? That remains unanswered. As modern historians began comparing records, strange contradictions emerged. Navy documents from the 1950s firmly denied any biological or chemical testing on the island. Yet Army paperwork from the same decade labeled the site as a material quarantine facility. The two descriptions didn't match. Meanwhile, another federal agency, never named, only referenced by initials, listed the island as a research outpost for coastal surveillance technology. But those same years show the island receiving shipments of protective gear, sealed canisters, and industrial-grade ventilation systems, equipment that had little to do with surveillance. At the National Archives, researchers discovered a peculiar pattern. Certain years where the island should appear in coastal infrastructure reports were mysteriously absent, entire sections removed, leaving behind blank spaces in official histories. In one instance, two versions of the same government document were found. The public version called the site a maintenance outpost. The internal version labeled it a restricted operations zone with controlled entry facilities. Such inconsistencies aren't standard clerical mistakes. They're signs of a location being managed on multiple levels, each with its own explanation, depending on who was asking. And still, no agency openly took responsibility for the island. Over time, a handful of former personnel spoke cautiously about their roles on the island. None provided a complete picture, but their fragments form a troubling mosaic. One former lab assistant recalled being issued protective suits for tasks he believed were unrelated to hazardous work. He never learned what he was protecting himself from. A maintenance technician, who spent only a few months there, described long corridors with sealed steel doors. Doors he said appeared older than the rest of the facility, as if they belonged to a previous era of construction. A nurse stationed at a nearby naval clinic remembered treating workers who arrived late at night, escorted by uniformed officers who remained silent during procedures. Patients rarely spoke about their injuries. A Marine patrol officer admitted he was instructed to disable his radio whenever his vessel approached the island's boundary. No chatter, no transmissions. Silence was protocol. None of them could identify the true purpose of the site. Each described a workplace divided into compartments. Everyone knew a small piece, and no one knew the whole. The only shared detail was a lingering sense that something on the island wasn't meant to be seen. Despite growing speculation, state officials consistently distanced themselves from the island. Development proposals were briefly raised during the 1960s, but quietly dismissed. Environmental researchers seeking to survey the area were denied entry without explanation. Even city planners, who oversaw nearly every square mile of New York's coastal infrastructure, admitted they had no authority over the site. Some claimed it fell exclusively under federal jurisdiction. Others suggested a multi-agency agreement, though no such agreement has ever been found in public records. For an island so close to one of the world's most populated cities, the absence of administrative oversight is extraordinary. Every parcel of coastal land typically has a paper trail, permits, assessments, zoning files. This island has almost none. And when asked who exactly controlled it, state offices consistently responded with two words: no comment. Long before aerial photography became accessible to the public, small charter pilots used to cut across the Long Island Sound on routine delivery routes. Most described the water, the coastline, the weather. Nothing unusual, but a handful of pilots noticed something odd. The airspace above the island kept expanding. At first, it was a modest advisory, the kind printed in old aviation bulletins. Over the years, that advisory hardened into a full no-fly radius. Pilots who once passed directly over the island were told to reroute miles away. One veteran pilot, who had flown the same delivery path since the late 1960s, recalled the first time he was warned mid-flight. No turbulence, no storm, no military exercise. Yet a voice on the radio instructed him to alter course immediately, without explanation. He described the tone as firm, almost rehearsed, as if the controller expected questions, and was prepared not to answer them. When high-resolution satellite imagery became easy to access, the island's surface features revealed something unusual. Certain structures showed damage inconsistent with simple weathering, roofs reinforced with thick shielding, walls discolored by exposure to intense conditions. One building's upper vents had been welded shut, while others carried signs of prolonged corrosion, patterns expected at industrial waste facilities, not small research stations. Drone operators who attempted to film the island from legal distances found themselves approached by patrol units within minutes. Some received formal warnings. Others reported their equipment losing signal near the island's perimeter, as if some form of interference was present. Over time, satellite photographs captured more than surface buildings. They revealed deep scars in the terrain, suggesting excavation or tunneling, entry points partially concealed by vegetation, ventilation grids that made little sense for small-scale operations, shadows indicating vertical structures descending below ground level. Nothing confirmed. Nothing explained. But every clue pointed downward, beneath the visible facilities, where no official documentation exists. Something underground mattered more than anything visible on the surface. When the Freedom of Information Act opened a narrow window into Cold War archives, researchers combed through thousands of faded documents. Most were mundane: budget ledgers, supply orders, personnel transfers. But scattered among the routine papers were fragments that raised more questions than answers. A thin folder referenced off-site containment transfer protocols, without listing what was being transferred or where it originated. Another memo described exposure drills, but avoided naming the material involved. One set of documents detailed sterilization chambers, including maintenance logs for industrial-scale equipment rarely used outside specialized facilities. Then came the most debated line, live environment subjects scheduled for monitoring. See Unit 14. No description of the subjects, no scientific category, only a reference to a sealed unit, one that does not appear on any public diagram of the island. In another binder, researchers found a photograph labeled, "Do not circulate. Island Unit 14." The photo itself remained redacted, replaced by a blank placeholder. These fragments didn't prove the dramatic theories that circulated for decades, but they did something more important. They contradicted the official narrative of a site engaged in nothing more than routine coastal research. One file hinted that the island's operations were connected to a project that was never acknowledged publicly. During the late 1970s, a local journalist attempted to piece together the island's real purpose. He investigated supply shipments, interviewed former contractors, and dug through maritime records. His first article suggested the island might have been used for chemical disposal during the early Cold War. Federal officials denied the claim immediately. They said the structures were part of a weather monitoring program. A simple explanation. Clean. Easy. But just weeks later, another reporter published an exposé showing that the so-called weather station used ventilation systems designed for industrial extraction, not atmospheric measurements. He also discovered that the equipment was purchased under a different department entirely, one known for classified projects. The contradiction didn't go unnoticed. Readers questioned why a weather station needed sealed loading bays and reinforced doors. The federal response? Silence. The first journalist quietly withdrew from the investigation. The second moved on to unrelated work. And the story disappeared from local newspapers almost as quickly as it appeared. The truth was slipping out, and someone was trying to patch the leaks. In the early 2000s, the island was still active on paper. Maintenance logs appeared in federal databases. Procurement reports showed occasional shipments, replacement parts, protective gear, and supplies typically used in older facilities that were still operational. Then, one spring, a joint inspection team arrived. Engineers, environmental specialists, and personnel whose agencies were never identified in public logs. They remained on the island for 2 consecutive days. When they left, everything changed. Within a week, several buildings were sealed with welded plates along their entrances. Heavy equipment was brought in during the night and removed before dawn. Residents in nearby communities reported seeing unmarked trucks carrying large containers boarding the island's pier. The official explanation surfaced soon after. The island was being closed due to aging infrastructure and potential safety hazards from deteriorating buildings. But the reasoning didn't align with the historical record. Safety logs from only 10 years prior showed that the structures had been reinforced with new steel framing and modern ventilation upgrades. There was no indication of instability, no mention of crumbling foundations or unsafe roofs. Internal emails, later uncovered by researchers, referenced something else entirely: prolonged contamination risks. No details, no clarifications. Just that phrase, repeated in multiple exchanges. Even more unusual, all personnel assigned to the island were relocated within days, some to offices hundreds of miles away. Facilities normally decommissioned through lengthy public processes were suddenly abandoned with minimal documentation. When questioned by the press, every involved agency used the same wording: operational concerns. No further comment. If the island was simply unsafe, why not repair it? Why abandon it entirely? 2 decades later, the island remains closed, not repurposed, not demolished, simply locked behind layers of restrictions that grow thicker every year. In 2014, surveillance systems around the island were upgraded. New motion sensors were installed along the perimeter. Patrol boats increased their routes, sometimes idling near the island for hours before leaving without explanation. Requests from environmental groups were denied, every single one. Historians seeking access for research were told that the island was not suitable for civilian presence. Emergency preparedness teams classified it as restricted terrain. Maps show it as nothing more than a green patch off the coast, but official maritime advisories describe its waters as monitored. Even recreational boaters who drift too close report being approached by patrol units and instructed to move away. For a location with no active facility, the oversight is unusual. For a place supposedly abandoned, the security is excessive. And despite repeated inquiries over the years, the same line is repeated. No authorized access. The island sits empty, yet heavily guarded. Why guard a place no one is allowed to enter? To understand what the island was likely used for, historians compare its timeline with broader patterns in American history. Cold War secrecy shaped countless coastal facilities, many hidden for decades before fragments of their story emerged. Facilities that once handled classified projects often shared similar characteristics: isolated locations, restricted airspace, compartmentalized worker assignments, sudden shifts in funding, records that contradict one another, sealed areas long after closure, unexplained drills, and careful distancing from state officials. The island's history follows this arc closely. During the Cold War, agencies worked under strict compartmentalization. A single site could house multiple programs without any one department knowing the full scope. Declassified documents from other facilities mention containment structures, environmental monitoring chambers, and sealed transit bays, architecture remarkably similar to the island's surviving blueprints. Federal biosafety standards of the era were different from today's. Older facilities often lacked documentation by modern standards, especially when projects were classified. Operations that involved hazardous materials, whether chemical, biological, or industrial, were frequently recorded only in fragmentary logs, many of which remain inaccessible. Several agencies maintained coastal testing sites during this period. They conducted containment research, disposal studies, and environmental stress tests. Some worked with volatile materials in controlled settings. Others focused on monitoring long-term effects of exposure or environmental drift. While no file openly names the island as part of a specific program, multiple clues converge. The presence of large sealed drums in witness accounts, ventilation systems inconsistent with meteorological research, structures with radiation warning designs, medical records sealed for decades, off-site containment transfers, references to environment subjects, and the rapid closure following an inspection team. All of these align more closely with facilities involved in sensitive containment research than with routine coastal operations. And then there is the silence. New York distancing itself, federal agencies remaining vague, long-term restrictions left unexplained. Historically, this pattern often signals one thing: a project that was classified, substantial, and potentially controversial by modern standards. The most convincing explanation is the one no agency wants to openly confirm. After the island's closure, surrounding communities formed theories to fill the silence. Some recalled unusual events from decades earlier: strange odors drifting across the water during certain winds, boats rerouted without warning, or periods when the coastline was unusually quiet. Researchers studying the region's environmental history noticed changes in monitoring patterns. Certain shoreline surveys increased in frequency. Water samples were taken more often, though the published reports remained vague about their purpose. Health studies along the coast looked at long-term exposure risks, but rarely mentioned the island directly. Instead, They referred to regional environmental assessments. Newly digitized archives revealed more pieces, inspection notes that hinted at unaddressed structural hazards, supply orders that didn't match reported functions, and handwritten memos from decades earlier mentioning controlled conditions that must be preserved. Historical comparisons help place these fragments in context. Across the country, numerous Cold War-era sites were eventually acknowledged to have housed sensitive programs. Some were benign by modern standards. Others raised questions long after closure. The island fits into this pattern, a place where the official narrative stays incomplete, where the timeline shows gaps, and where the surviving evidence suggests more was occurring behind closed doors than the public record reflects. Researchers today continue to analyze these inconsistencies. Some focus on missing budget entries, others on satellite imagery. All arrive at the same conclusion: pieces of the island's history remain intentionally out of reach. The island's story is part of a larger conversation about secrecy in American history. Many facilities built during periods of heightened tension later revealed operations far different from their public descriptions. Debates continue about whether retired sites should be opened to scholars, environmental experts, or the public. Some argue transparency is essential. Others insist certain histories must remain classified due to ongoing national security concerns. In recent years, advocacy groups have pushed for a review of the island's status. They question why access remains restricted, why records remain sealed, and why New York continues to defer responsibility to federal agencies. Historians note that without full disclosure, the island becomes a symbol, one of the many places where significant work occurred under layers of confidentiality, shaping events that left no clear paper trail. And while some records will eventually surface, others may remain sealed indefinitely. Not because of dramatic content, but because they were created in an era when classification was broad, long-lasting, and rarely revisited. The unanswered questions surrounding the island reflect a larger issue: how much of America's Cold War history remains incomplete? Based on the evidence, what do you believe the island was really used for? And which part of its history should be examined next? If you want more untold stories from American history, feel free to subscribe. New episodes every day.